Hell in the Land of the Morning Calm, Chapter 10. On the lighter side, I remember the time that 3 Russian T-34 tanks had broken through our lines and had been hit by our Air Force. 2 of them were knocked out by one. Oh, excuse me. 2 of them were knocked out, but one was still in action. The tank still in action had the tracks and boggy wheels knocked off. It was between the other 2 tanks. It could not have gone any place, but its machine guns and 88 millimeter cannon still worked. I was watching all this through some field glasses. Suddenly, up came 2 medics in a litter jeep. I thought, surely they will stop soon. They just kept coming. Finally, they came to a stop, took 2 patients out of the litter rack in the back and laid them in a nearby ditch. One of them was fumbling around in the glove compartment of the Jeep. I could hardly believe my eyes. Out he came with a live hand grenade. If the pin had jarred out of that grenade, it would have blown that Jeep to pieces. They took off in the Jeep, pulled up beside the tank that was still active, and one of the medics leaped to the top of the tank and knocked on the hatch. As hard as it is to believe, one of the men inside the tank opened the hatch and peeked out. The medic shoved the grenade inside and sat down on the hatch door. An explosion followed that lifted that 34-ton tank off the ground. They had not fastened the hatch top, and when their 88 millimeter shells went off, it sent the medic who was sitting on the hatch lid sailing through the air like a missile, burying him head first in a rice paddy. Although I failed to fully appreciate some of the things that happened like that until later, some of the most humorous things I have ever witnessed happened in Korea during the war. There was the guy in my platoon who had been pinned down all day during this one summer day. It was very hot, and this young soldier decided to go down the hill to a watermelon patch that was in sight of our position. I had ordered him not to go, but since we were out of water and it was sizzling hot, he took off for the patch the first chance he got. He had just bent over to pick up a melon when a sniper got him right in the seat of the pants. Although he was a large man, he was a great broken field runner that day. It took half the company to convince him that he was not mortally wounded. He did bring the watermelon back with him and became famous as the Melon Patch Commando. Then there were those who were not as smart as they could have been. I remember visiting with some friends in a rear area during the early days of the war. I was standing talking to a couple of guys when we heard a sentry challenge someone. The challenged party, who turned out to be the commanding officer of the company, kept being challenged every few feet. He was getting more irritated by the second. Suddenly, he stopped and yelled at the top of his voice, "Fireball!" Fireball was the nickname of the soldier's first sergeant. The first sergeant came running out shouting, "Yes, sir!" At the time of this incident, that particular company was camped on the bank of the Naktong River. It is a shallow river, though fairly wide. "What are all these men doing on this river bank?" shouted the company commander. "Watching for submarines," replied the nervous sergeant. "Submarines?" shouted the captain. "Tell me you didn't say submarines." "I don't believe in taking any chances," replied the sergeant. "Do you realize they have been driving jeeps and trucks over that river all day?" demanded the captain. "I'll give you 5 minutes to get these men to bed," he shouted. Needless to say, the sergeant was soon shipped out. I remember crossing a river one day in a Jeep. We had just about reached the middle of the river when the Jeep drowned out. About the time the Jeep drowned out, we were ambushed by the enemy. I jumped from the Jeep, raced to the bank of the river, and located a big rock to give myself cover. Suddenly, I heard yelling from behind me and turned to see two GIs, lead flying all around them, arguing over who owned a head of Chinese cabbage. Then there was the guy who shot off his big toe on his right foot, practicing his fast draw. He was afterwards known as Hoppy. Another thing that stands out in my mind is the day I killed a magpie. Korea is covered with these big black and white birds called magpies. They are without a doubt the noisiest bird in the world. I had located a grassy spot in the shade of a Korean house and had just settled down for a nice rest when a flock of magpies landed in a nearby tree. Never have I heard such chatter. I shot up into the tree to scare the birds off. I had never been successful in bringing down one of these magpies. Though they appear to be almost as large as a crow, they are nearly all feathers. To my surprise, one of them came tumbling down when I shot into the tree. Suddenly, there was a mass of magpies coming for me. It looked like hundreds of them. As they began to dive at me, I beat my retreat into the Korean house. I could hardly believe what followed. They sent several other GIs scrambling for cover. Then it looked as though they lined up about 3 or 4 abreast and marched around the dead bird and made sounds as though they were mourning. Now here I was, a big, bad combat infantryman with an automatic weapon, hiding in a house from a bunch of birds. To make it worse, I was feeling like a murderer. They finally left after a couple of hours. I never shot at a magpie again. Many lessons are learned under these trying conditions that later are quite amusing. I remember the first time we had a chance to spend the night in one of the Korean peasant houses after the bitter winter had set in. In one end of these houses is the kitchen where the food is prepared in iron pots over a wood or charcoal fire. These houses do not have a chimney going up the outside of the house. Instead, it goes under the house. The heat and smoke going under the house heat the clay floors, thus providing heat for the house. We built a fire in the kitchen and waited for the floor to get warm. It seemed the heating process wasn't doing so well, so we kept throwing wood to it. What we hadn't taken into consideration was the fact that when the clay floor was warm on the top, it was very hot on the bottom. The clay holds the heat for long periods of time. Off to bed we went in our sleeping bags. Sometime during the night, I awakened wet with sweat. Then I noticed the smell of smoke. To my consternation, it was my sleeping bag. You should have seen the dances we did when our barefoot hit that red-hot clay floor. We set a new speed record getting back on the sleeping bags, putting on our boots, and evacuating the house. Another time, we were involved in an operation and were making sure not to leave anything behind for the communists. We were killing all the animals and burying the grain to prevent the North Korean soldiers from using it since they didn't carry supplies with them. I was walking down the street one day and saw some of the South Korean interpreters beating an old man. Sometimes these South Koreans got pretty rough, so I stopped to ask them what they were doing. One of the interpreters said, "This old man is the #1 communist in this town." "How do you know that?" I asked them. "Well, we know. During the course of the conversation, we discovered that this man was the president of the bank in town. I thought, well, the money is no good to me, but it would be good to the communists. They could buy ammunition or anything with it. So I made the old man take us down to the bank. When we arrived at the bank, he wouldn't open the vault. He claimed he didn't know the combination. I told him, well, if you don't open it, I'm going to blast it open. He still refused to open it, so I took 3 hand grenades and wired them to the door of the vault of the bank. One would have been more than enough, but for some reason I put 3 on the door. I fastened some little fine communication wire to the pins, stretched it out away from the building, got down in a ditch, and jerked the pins out. Of course, the grenades went off. I just wanted to get the door open, but I blew the whole side of the building out. I backed the truck up and we got the thing about half full of money. A little while later, my company commander came along and asked, Plemmons, what do you have in that truck? I need a truck. I didn't answer him. He came over to me and asked, what's the matter with you? Are you deaf? I need a truck. What do you have there? I said, money, sir. Looking at me sternly, he said, I haven't got any time for foolishness. I had the money covered over with a piece of tarpaulin. He grabbed the tarpaulin, threw it back, and saw all that money. Where did you get that? He demanded. I robbed a bank, sir. You did what? I robbed a bank, sir, I repeated. When I told him how I got it, he fell on the ground laughing. What are you going to do with it? He asked. I'm going to give it to the refugees, sir. So when we were driving along and saw a bunch of old men, old women, and little children, refugees going south, getting away from the communists, I would take a big armload of the money and throw it out in the road. They would go wild gathering it up. It was kind of like being a modern-day Robin Hood, I guess. End of chapter 10.